Welcome back to our course on conflict of interest for professionals. In this module, we will discuss some of the principles arising in discussions about conflict of interest and how to identify a conflict of interest situation. Our first conflict of interest principle is the golden rule that you should be impartial. Taking an excerpt from the International Barristers Association, you should be impartial and independent at the time of accepting an assignment and shall remain so until the final decision. This applies if facts or circumstances exist or arise which a reasonable third person, having knowledge of the relevant facts and circumstances, would conclude that there is a likelihood that you may be influenced by factors other than the facts of the issue in reaching your decision. The two highlighted terms are somewhat at odds. Is it likely that you may be influenced? This goes beyond the mere possibility of a conflict, but not quite to the point of an actual conflict. Do you agree with the principle requiring a likelihood? Or is just a possibility of a conflict enough? Following up on the golden rule, we have several other principles. These include serving the best legitimate interests of your client, supporting transparency and scrutiny, promoting responsibility and setting an example, resolving any conflicts between your interests and your duties and responsibilities in favor of your client, and promoting a culture that is intolerant of conflicts of interest. These are subjective principles. You may add, delete, or modify them as you see appropriate. Remember from a previous module that perceived conflict of interest is just as important as a real conflict of interest. Think of Trudeau's Caribbean vacations. Do they leave you with a feeling of confidence in government integrity? So appearance is the key. It does not matter what you think of your own innocence and integrity, nor is there any obligation on anyone else to prove that you've been disloyal. What matters is the perception. We're talking about a perceived conflict of interest. Who is doing the perceiving? Well, first of all, not you. You must try to see a conflict of interest from an outside observer's point of view. As some scholars have said, what assessment would a fair-minded member of the public make of the circumstances? Or the appearance of anything, including a conflict of interest, surely lies in the mind of the beholder, not in the conduct of the beheld. How much proof of impropriety is required before a conflict of interest is real? According to the Federal Court of Appeal, the test is, could an informed person, viewing the matter realistically and practically, and having thought the matter through, think it more likely than not that you, whether consciously or unconsciously, will be influenced in the performance of your duties by considerations having to do with your private interests. So we need an informed person. But what does well-informed mean? Must they conduct extensive research into all the circumstances, become knowledgeable about everything to do with it, engage in deep thinking, taking hours, days, weeks before they come to a conclusion? Here we have a dilemma. If we require the informed person to be too informed, we would not have any informed persons at all. But if the standard is too low, then anyone with an opinion on the matter could chime in. That is equally damaging. So what can we do? One thing we can do is to not treat all conflicts the same. By ranking conflicts, we can vary the effort required to be informed. We could, for instance, require more effort to be made to be informed when the issue is serious, or there are major implications if a conflict is declared, or even taking more effort to be informed if we have the time. Now, we're talking about the perceptions of an informed person here. But what is perception? What do we mean by the term? After considering all the available information, has the observer come to a proper conclusion? Or gone off on some wild conspiracy theory? How do we evaluate the validity of someone else's perception? First of all, we must avoid voting with the majority. As the Supreme Court said, apparent conflict of interest is not a matter of yielding to public suspicion or malicious criticism. Looking for an objective standard of perception here, the courts have struck on an old standby: the reasonable person. Given the available facts, could a reasonable person come to the conclusion that the observer came to? Note that this is not, would you come to that conclusion? Your opinion really doesn't matter. The question is whether there is enough evidence available to support the observer's conclusion, even if the evidence equally supports your competing conclusion. Related to the issue of identifying conflict of interest is the question of whether conflict of interest can be so small that, in effect, the conflict ceases to be relevant. What do you think? Are there conflicts that have no bearing on anything at all? To me, the answer is no. Conflict of interest is about trust. When we start to bend the rules even slightly, you erode that trust. That said, what you do about a small conflict of interest may be radically different from what you do about a larger conflict. Now let's discuss another scenario. Suppose Shirley has invested in ABC Mining Corporation since she was a teenager. Last year, Shirley was elected to Parliament. Part of her duties as a member of Parliament is to represent the interest of her constituents. ABC Mining wants to open a mine in Shirley's constituency. The mine would substantially boost ABC's earnings and thus Shirley's dividends. The mine has passed environmental assessment and has wide public support with no significant opposition from anyone. However, it is one of 5 projects vying for the same pot of government money. If Shirley does not personally fight for the project, it will die. What should Shirley do? There is no definite answer here. In this case, the duty to perform a task results in an unintended personal benefit. As Shirley performs her duties as a member of Parliament and fights for the mine that her constituents want, she enriches herself. And it is that personal benefit that raises the question of conflict of interest. Should you do if you conclude you have a conflict of interest? Well, there are commonly three basic steps. 1. Review your situation and identify that you have a conflict of interest. 2. Own up to it. Let others know that you have a conflict. And then 3. Address the conflict. This last part we will address in a later module. A survey of major developed countries shows that almost all governments identify external employment and gifts as having a high potential for conflict of interest. This is followed by business and family relations, with the former being identified more often. Interestingly, your personal finances, such as debts and assets, gets the lowest scores, being noted by about half of the countries. A similar survey trying to list activities with the potential for conflict of interest again shows outside employment to be at the top. But still, a significant number of countries list participation in political parties or even trade unions as potential conflicts. Some even list voluntary organizations. But these simple lists are obviously leaving things out or making categories too general. In the end, conflict of interest is too broad to simply list all possible conflicts. We need some tools to help us. Two such tools are risk registers and checklists. An example of a risk register from Australia looks partially like this. Think of organizational risk. You operate in an isolated small community to provide goods or services, enforce regulations. Do you have discretionary power? On the personal side, do you have any personal financial interests? Are you involved in any family or private businesses that are affected by your decision? What about affiliation in organizations, the political, even sporting bodies, religious? Do you have any family relations that might be affected? And even contracting out risk. Are there any gifts that might be received, even small ones? And the allocation of contracts under the tender threshold. How are they being handled? And is the evaluation process being properly run? I note that the participant guide has a more comprehensive list of these items from Australia. An example of a checklist from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, or CBC, looks partially like this. As far as gifts, does the value exceed $200? Could it be perceived as a bribe? Is it given to influence your decision? And when you talk about perceived conflict of interest, could the situation be perceived as affecting your objectivity? Could the situation be perceived as you're using your position for personal gain? And even about competition, is the activity's purpose to broadcast products similar to those of the CBC? Is it in competition? Is it for the benefit of a competing media organization? It would entail interviews that the CBC might want to have. Again, note the participant guide has a more comprehensive list. In either risk register or checklist, we can see lists of similar situations that can give rise to a conflict of interest. As we're going through these registers and lists, the issue of remoteness arises. When is your involvement more direct than remote? As one observer said, your interest is probably not remote if all the following are true. There is some involvement between you or a person related to you and the other party. Your involvement is more than a mere passive association. You have endorsed or promoted the other party, or there is some active conduct that you have done in some legal or similar duty. And has your involvement contributed measurably to the other party's operations or prospect, or benefited you personally? So just another test of remoteness. Again, you can modify these, but it does emphasize the point that there are no definite lines in the sand here. A common thread is often significant. This concludes our discussion of conflict of interest principles and identifying conflicts of interest. I invite you now to move on to Module 6, where we will discuss dealing with conflicts of interest.